the Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees Mogg about the topics of the day. Welcome to episode 4 of the Moggcast. I'm Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation again with Jacob Rees Mogg. Now, Jacob, I would dearly love to have a conversation with you that wasn't about Brexit, the EU and Europe. It was about something else. This week, yet again, I've regretfully decided this is impossible, and we must return to Brexit because there's so much going on. I'm going to start with a very general question, which is, we have Corbyn's speech today, we have the Prime Minister's speech on Friday. What are you hoping she's going to say, and what do you think are the main issues that remain to be resolved?
The noises that have come out post the Chequers meeting are very encouraging. You wrote a piece saying that it was David Davis's approach to Brexit, and that's something I've got a great deal of confidence in personally. I think David Davis knows what he's doing and he's very clear. And the idea that there will be some rules that we accept voluntarily from the EU because we're selling into the European market is one that's always been there, that you always have to abide by the rules of a country you are selling to. So if we're selling to China, we have to follow Chinese rules, to the European Union by EU rules, but that it is our own choice that we have control of those rules, and if events change, we will be able to change the rules accordingly. This seems a very sensible form of Brexit, out of the customs union and out of the single market. Being out of those two means we've genuinely left. Remaining in either of those essentially ties us into the EU without being able to make the rules that would affect us.
Essentially, you've just cast some light back on what happened at Chequers. Just going forward again, does the Prime Minister need on Friday to resolve the length of transition, more details about what will happen during it, and the position on the customs union? And is there anything else I've missed out that is absolutely central to be decided, in your view, on Friday?
I think you're absolutely on the key issues, the length of transition. The EU has said to the end of the multi-annual financial framework, and that's very important because the EU is right. If we stay beyond that, our contributions in the final quarter could be quite large because it will be on a new multi-annual financial framework which we will have had no say in putting together. So length of transition we want to know. What happens during that transition? And here there are 3 issues. One is free movement, one is the role of the ECJ, and the third is the imposition of new rules. And those are the problem areas there. And then the end state. We need more detail on the end state. But whisper this quietly. I think Eurosceptics, including me, should have more confidence in the Prime Minister. So far, she hasn't said or done anything that has contradicted her clear statement that Brexit means Brexit. There's sometimes been leaks coming out of Whitehall and mood music saying things are going to change, but so far every time she's made a public pronouncement, it's remained broadly the same.
The position to date has been that the scope of the court during the transition will be the same as now, has it not?
That's been the mood music. I think that would be an error. I think the court, once we no longer have a judge on it and we're not a member of the European Union, cannot be the final arbiter of UK law. It cannot decide its own area of jurisdiction, which it effectively now does. But there seems to me a very workable compromise, which is that we should treat the ECJ as we do the European Court of Human Rights. And we should say to the EU that we will in good faith respect the ECJ's judgments and we will implement them through Parliament in the normal course of events, but that we will not be obliged to. And as with the ECHR, if it makes bizarre rulings, we'd be able to block it, not to do it. If, on the other hand, it rules as a tribunal would, as a fair and impartial body, then accepting its rulings and implementing them through Parliament shouldn't be problematic.
Just on free movement, the position to date is, if you've been in Britain for 5 years, up until the date of Brexit, pretty much, you can apply for settled status. In other words, the regime changes, that's the plan on the date of Brexit. How disturbed would you be if that was rolled forward to the end of transition rather than the date of Brexit?
I think it would be a major problem, partly because the Prime Minister has said precisely the opposite, and the Prime Minister is a lady of her word, and that one of the factors in the Brexit vote was concern over uncontrolled migration from the European Union. And we will have left, and therefore they shouldn't have the same free movement rights. There needs to be a difference between the 29th and the 30th of March 2019. And the EU says the four freedoms are entirely interconnected and indivisible. This isn't true. In the deal it's done with the Ukraine, the EU wouldn't offer them free movement of people, much though Ukraine wanted to have it. So they divide them when it suits them. They don't want to divide them now, but we should be very robust on this. And there is, I suppose, the question of delivery to the electorate and what they voted for, but also questions of competence of the Home Office. The real reason seems to be that the Home Office doesn't think it's up to it. Now, I've got a great deal of confidence in Anne Murad, who's a very effective Home Secretary. She knows what she's doing, and I'm confident that she can beat her department into shape to make sure it delivers on the Prime Minister's promise.
Are you confident, talking of transition, by the way, that the customs systems, the border controls, anything else we need, like enough vets to cope, will be ready by the end of transition, whenever that is? Because one could foresee a circumstance by which the machine, perhaps ministers, suddenly throw up their hands and say, guess what? The system isn't working as it's meant to work. That does happen sometimes in politics, and our systems aren't ready to leave transition on the date that was promised. Terribly sorry about that. Nothing we can do. We're going to have to extend transition up until the general election and beyond. Are you worried this could happen?
Well, HMRC has already made very clear that it could have a customs system up and running by March of next year. So it could do it if we left without a deal, and that's been given in evidence to a number of select committees. So I think that issue has been dealt with. But there are two aspects of this. There's the aspect going out and there's the aspect coming in. In terms of things coming in, we have discretion to decide. So we can say, okay, we haven't got enough customs inspectors, therefore we're going to carry on allowing EU goods to come into the UK. And that's a decision we can make, and it doesn't need any transition, it doesn't need any agreement from the EU. Then there's the question of going out, and that's a matter for the European Union to have the systems in place to deal with our goods going to the EU. And in Rotterdam, they are already employing more customs officials to make sure it happens smoothly. But we can't agree an extension transition if the EU hasn't got systems in place, because that would give them an incentive not to put the systems in place to bind us into the EU.
You're not worried about the apparent nightmare prospect of lorries being backed up in Kent because there's not enough parking space for them and so on and so forth?
Well, the issue there is really whether the Calais authorities are capable of dealing with the number of lorries going back, a third of which are empty. So they shouldn't be too difficult. And if they don't get back, it's quite a problem for the European logistics operation, because they would be missing a lot of lorries that they need for further onward goods movement. The two-thirds that have goods in them going back to the EU, part of our arrangement, part of our deal will be that the EU will facilitate their passing through. And that isn't unduly complicated. That's done in lots of other parts of the world very efficiently and very effectively. So the EU already has some systems in the Sweden-Norway border, operates very efficiently. This shouldn't be a problem.
And just turning from it to the customs union, the position really is pretty clear. We're not going to be in the customs union. The Prime Minister said that. We're not going to be in a customs union. The reason for that is we don't want to be in the common commercial policy, be bound by the common external tariff. I mean, she said all that at Lancaster House. If a motion is put down to keep us in the customs union effectively, a customs union like this customs union, and Conservative MPs inclined to support it, a small number, no doubt, but some do, Anna Soubry has tabled an amendment. Should the government make this a vote of confidence?
Well, can I rewind briefly on the customs union issue, because Turkey is not in the customs union, it is in a customs union with the European Union as its counterparty. It does not have the free passage of goods from Turkey to the EU. For us to be in the customs union effectively means we have to be a member of the European Union. A customs union doesn't help you on the passage of goods. The customs union means you haven't left. In the customs union, Labour risks signing us up to TTIP, the partnership with the United States, which might potentially open the National Health Service to American competition, which Labour has strongly been opposed to.
They're not saying, as I understand, they're going to be in the customs union, they're going to be in a customs union.
Well, I thought Mr. Gardner on the radio this morning was saying they were going to be in exactly the same customs union as they're currently in. But perhaps we'll find out
The one
more.
he said would leave us a vassal state in the summer before you use the phrase.
That's right.
Right.
And now he quite likes being a vassal, as does Jeremy Corbyn, against what he'd preached for 30 years. But leaving that to one side...
But then, sorry to press this, but they can't leave the European Union in that case. You can't stay in the customs union and leave the EU.
That's right. They're asking for something that is either Turkey, which doesn't really work, or is remaining in the European Union, which they say is not their policy. But the risk of either of them is that they're absolutely obsessed by the TTIP issue. But the EU could sign TTIP without the UK having a vote, without the UK having any representation, and the NHS would be opened up to competition from American firms without so much as a buy your leave. So this is socialists wishing to bring American businesses into the NHS. And if they think that's a popular policy, I wish them every success. But to come to your question, should it be a vote of confidence? It doesn't work like that anymore. So, when Harold Wilson was Prime Minister and Jim Callaghan, if a vote was lost, the government, having announced it was a vote of confidence, would go to the palace and say Parliament should be dissolved. Now, Parliament can only be dissolved subject to a vote of confidence with specific wording under the Fixed Term Parliament Act. That means you cannot say a vote on the customs union is per se a vote of confidence. What you can say is that this is a vote where if I lose it, I will resign, or if I lose it, I will put down a motion to move to a general election that requires 2/3 of MPs to vote in favour. But that is very different. Instead of it being a follow-on from losing a vote, there's then an active decision to do something that most Conservative MPs wouldn't want. And therefore I don't think it works. I don't want the government to lose on the customs union, and it may be that threatening a vote of confidence would help them, but I think the changes constitutionally alter it from being a process to being an active decision.
Very interesting.
And I don't think most Conservative MPs want that. So if there was a vote on the customs union and the government lost and there were a vote of no confidence the next day, the government would win. And the two are not the same. And I don't think under the Fixed Terms Parliament Act you can make them the same.
I think a way I would rework that idea is, I think you're saying to me, look, Paul, once upon a time you might have been able to do that. But I'm telling you in terms, a lot of my colleagues, and some ministers too, are in no position, in their view, to want a general election. They don't want it. The Prime Minister couldn't really do this, even if she wanted to, because the backing for it simply isn't there.
Well, I think that's right. I think you could get to the ridiculous position that the Prime Minister might propose. I mean, I don't think she'll do this, because she's far too sensible, that we move to a general election and require 2/3 majority, and Tory MPs vote against it because they don't want to move to a general election.
Would render her whole position as Prime Minister questionable.
Well, I just don't think this is realistic. What do you think some of the cabinet members with marginal seats would say about the prospect of a general election, some of whom may think of themselves as future leadership candidates? People can work out who I'm thinking about, but they're not going to want a general election in circumstances that would be very unfavourable for the party, because we would be in a complete muddle.
No, I mean, in a marginal seat like arguably Uxbridge, we're told it's now marginal, I don't know, perhaps Hastings, this is a marginal seat, is it not? You're nodding away, but
yes, I confirm that this is well known, and that. But I have a majority of 10,000. My seat was a Labour seat up until 2010. We want to have a general election in 2022 when Brexit has been dealt with and we're getting on to dealing with housing, funding the NHS, tax reform, all sorts of other issues that the government has to deal with.
Just going back for a moment, under fixed terms, you can, under fixed terms, call a vote, as the government did only last summer. Of course, you can effectively put yourself out, can you not, and ask the opposition to go in, which I doubt if Jeremy Corbyn would do.
Well, you'd be in the position of Disraeli in 1873, if I get my year right, where Gladstone resigned, hoping that Disraeli would take on a minority prime ministership, and Disraeli refused because he wanted to force Gladstone to dissolve, and it worked very well for Disraeli refusing, and he then won the 1874 election with a comfortable majority. This is very interesting speculative constitutional territory from my point of view, but I don't see this happening. You see, under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, if the government resigns, the Queen then has to send for a Prime Minister who can command a majority. If there's nobody, then you move to an election in a fortnight. But if the Prime Minister can still command a majority, then surely the Queen just asks the Prime Minister to carry on.
So just to clear another matter up, if it's not a vote of confidence, there'd be no case at all for withdrawing the whip from anyone who happened to vote for such an amendment.
I've argued before, I think the Conservative Party is a broad church.
Yeah.
The whip was withdrawn by John Major from some Maastricht rebels. It just made his life more difficult. Withdrawing the whip is a very serious threat for people who are completely opposed to the government. I think doing it on the European issue would be an error because there are people within the Conservative Party who I hold in the highest regard, who I disagree with on Europe. That doesn't make them bad Conservatives, they just have a very principled and different view. And they ought to stick to what was in the manifesto and leaving the customs union was, unless they've specifically said so in their own personal election addresses, which some of them may well have done. But withdrawing the whip seems to me to be narrowing the appeal of the Conservative Party and moving away from the approach historically we've always had of welcoming people in who are broadly within the Conservative family.
Just going back for a moment to the principles, the issue of the customs union. One thing we're constantly told now from certain quarters is you can't resolve the problem of the Irish border unless we're in the customs union. What's your answer to that?
Well, my answer to that is simply not true. Even the European Parliament produced a paper saying the border could be done with technological solutions. So even people who aren't sympathetic to our leaving have worked out that it is possible to do. And you forget, or people forget, that we will have control of how we police that border. So if we simply say there is not a border, people and goods are free to cross it, who is going to enforce it? It's a matter for the EU, then it's their problem, not ours. And do you really think the Irish are going to impose a border of their own volition? I mean, you know Ireland much better than I do, for family reasons. But do you think the Republic of Ireland is going to put up border posts because it's told to by Monsieur Barnier?
Well, it's an interesting question here. Because, Barnier takes my mind to France, and of course the French are taking a very different view of this to the Irish. They're pointing to the border and saying, hang on, this isn't, as you acknowledge, just your border, this is the EU border. And we're worried about the standard of produce and goods that may come from the UK into the EU over the only land borders. So Ireland, though I think some Irish politicians are reluctant to admit it, is feeling competing pushes here. There's a push from us to get the best deal that we can find in our national interest. There are also other countries who are zealously watching the border and want it up to a point to be in that word we're all not meant to use, hard?
Well, that's a matter for the French government, but it does seem to me to be like posturing, that we know at the moment that the standards in the UK and in the EU are the same, and that whatever happens, the UK is going to maintain high standards of produce that is sold in the United Kingdom. And it's slightly fanciful that herds of cows are going to be taken across the Irish border and then put on a ship to France, taking with them dangerous English diseases, that I think it's basically a negotiating point to try and pressurise the Irish to ensure that the Irish border becomes a more difficult issue than in reality it is for other interests that France has. France basically wants our money because otherwise it has to pay more into the European Union budget.
Presumably your view is, of these contested paragraphs in the agreement that was reached before Christmas, that the principle that was expounded at Chequers as mutual recognition, in effect, would solve the problem of regulation, which some people in Ireland are arguing can only be dealt with if we stay in the single market and the customs union.
Well, I think that's wrong. I think mutual recognition is a sensible thing for developed states to do. I think we should have mutual recognition of US standards. Any pharmaceutical has been approved by the Federal Drugs Agency. I would be very happy for it to be sold in the United Kingdom without needing to go through separate tests within the UK, that the FDA set some of the highest standards in the world. Likewise, I'd be very happy for agreements to be reached between the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the FCA in the UK for financial regulation, that I don't think we should have this narrow European sphere. We should look to the world and look to countries where the standards are high enough that we can accept them without additional checking. And bear in mind, the EU uses standards as a non-tariff barrier. So under CETA, the Canadian deal, chemicals can be imported into the European Union free of duty. They still have to register with REACH. But the Canadians have a very good reputation for their standards. They're as well regulated as any European country. The only reason for making their chemicals register with REACH is as a non-tariff barrier.
I'm going to have to ask you at this point, since you've raised the point about goods and services coming into the United Kingdom from America and Canada, I'm going to have to ask you the chlorinated chicken question.
As I understand it, there's no longer chlorinated chicken, that practice has ended. But the issue here is, I think, one of labelling. I think you should let people know what they're buying. The New Zealanders did an investigation into chlorinated chicken before their free trade deal. And they discovered that no consumer had ever been harmed by the chlorination of chicken. The only people who felt any health effects were the inspectors who'd gone around inspecting how the chlorination was done, and they'd got a bit too much chlorine. The New Zealanders thought it was perfectly safe, and I think you should let people know, this chicken's been chlorinated, this one hasn't. Which do you want to buy?
So if the practice hasn't ended, you'd be content, unlike Michael Gove, for it to come here as long as it was properly labelled?
As long as people know, yes. I think you should trust the consumer to decide for him or herself whether they want to risk chlorinated chicken or whether they think it's disgusting. As there's chlorine in their tap water, I doubt many people would be too worried.
What's your sense overall of where the negotiations are now? I ask simply because I've reached the view that the British media, while very well set up to cover what happens at Westminster and capable of putting it all under a magnifying glass, isn't so well set up to put Barnier and company under the same rigorous and cynical scrutiny that they put Westminster politicians under sometimes. So it's therefore very hard to tell how much in the EU position is fixed and permanent and how much of it is malleable and negotiable.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think there is a tendency to view any statement that comes out of the EU as being holy writ and it must be done. Whereas we discovered with the Barnier footnote that we would be punished if we didn't behave ourselves by the Commission, that was not a holy writ. That was very quickly retracted when other member states said, look, this is just ridiculous, you're going too far. And so I think we must remember that this is a negotiation. And the key thing to remember, when our negotiators go to bed at night, they should say to themselves, for the 21 months remaining of the multi-annual financial framework, without our money, the European Union is bust. For the 21 months remaining of the multi-annual financial framework, without our money, the European Union is bust. It has no legal ability to borrow, and neither the Germans want to pay more, nor do the Poles wish to receive less. And that is our best playing card.
Just ask one final question about the financial deal that was agreed in outline over Christmas. How much of that money should we pay over during transition, if any?
We shouldn't pay anything until the final deal is agreed. But without the money, their finances just don't work. It is our strongest card. As soon as we've paid, our negotiating position is weakened. This is really important. The other thing that's crucial is that though that was agreed in stage one, the money relates to all the remaining stages of the negotiation. Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And if we don't get a good trade deal, we take our money away. If we don't get a good implementation deal, we take our money away. And that's what they need. That's what holds their feet to the fire.
Jacob, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And thank you all for listening. The Mogcast will be back in exactly a fortnight's time. And in the meantime, you can listen to it on SoundCloud, on iTunes, on YouTube, and of course via the Conservative Home website.
The Mogcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees Mogg about the topics of the day.